Hello, my name is Colin Peacock. In this session, I'm joined by Professor Michael Townsley, and we are looking at the challenge around benchmarking e-commerce loss KPIs and exploring just what some of the key metrics might be to understand the levels of loss that e-commerce trading may be experiencing. Good evening then, I should say, but it's soon time to put another prawn on the barbie, yeah?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Well, look, the reason for just jumping on this sort of, call is just to talk through just, what we took away from our first ever meeting with retailers on actually how they are, if you like, KPIing the problem of e-commerce loss. So, what are the KPIs and what are actually some of the numbers that they're looking at? And, this is with a view to a long-term, perhaps, getting out there and publishing a sort of, the equivalent of a sort of shrink number for an e-commerce loss operation, so that we know where we should be fishing for and looking for new interventions. So we had 6 retailers on, some based in Europe, some based in America. A lot of them had global operations, so familiar with operations in, for example, Mexico through to Australia, through to Canada and Europe and UK and beyond. Really fascinating meeting. What were your takeaways?
Well, yes, I thought it was fascinating. Lots of information, like high information ratio. One of the first things that struck me was that when we started to get into, the second, third retailer, they were talking about the same thing, but often using different terms for...
confusing, right?
Yeah. So I was, we often sometimes would say, when you say that, what does that actually mean? Some people were talking about delivery or disputes about deliveries, and then another retailer were talking about errors to do with outgoings, and then the returns were incomings, and so that was constant
acceptance rates and block sales and you're right.
Constant translation. So I guess so that was the first thing I was thinking, how are we going to try to establish some sort of common terminology? But then when we sort of stepping back, thinking about all the different retailers and the ways that they were measuring the things that were important to them, they did seem to kind of revolve around about 2 or 3 things. I thought there was the acceptance rate or the block rate. There was a few retailers would talk about the percentage of transactions that were flagged as suspicious, but then were ultimately, approved after some sort of manual intervention. Everyone talked about a chargeback rate. And then there was some variation with just about everybody in deliveries and returns, disputes around deliveries or return errors. And all of those indicators were all expressed as percentages. It wasn't really, there were some that were dollar values, but largely it was percentage of sales, which makes it really easy to compare, business to business. Obviously, different categories are probably going to have different levels, but, percentages, it's just a rate, so it makes it able to make valid comparisons. And actually, the other thing was that just about everyone talked about their percentage this year compared to last year. So it was either year to date or year on year, which is great. So what we've got with all these indicators is magnitude and direction. You get the direction from, comparisons from multiple years or time periods, and the magnitude is just what the score is, the percentage. So, those were the commonalities for me, that was quite consistent across the board. And then sort of stepping back, it did seem that a lot of the conversation was around malicious loss and sort of fraud, particularly, I thought. But there didn't seem to be too much around non-malicious loss, or certainly it was a less prominent aspect of the conversation. If people did mention different problems, then it wasn't the majority. It was sort of a minority of retailers that were talking about non-malicious loss. And Adrian's spoken many times around, we have known loss and unknown loss, and in the known bucket there is malicious and non-malicious, and there's lots of examples where non-malicious loss can actually be far greater than the the magnitude of the malicious loss. So I thought that was quite interesting, and the potential for broadening our scope for what is loss in the e-com space. Non-malicious is there, and arguably might have possibly better data, but easier to capture data, easy to measure those sorts of problems compared to the malicious space.
Yeah, I think your point is well made. I think that the cohorts and the representatives of the retailers we had were really focused on sort of payment fraud, perhaps returns fraud, and maybe less with the sort of mistakes that happen every day with couriers and others. But again, I think we can find this sort of where there's an opportunity to make an innocent mistake, if you like, there's an opportunity for fraud. So, I think we've encouraged at ECR that, professionals look at the whole, there's someone who oversees the whole lot, so that, you really do have an end-to-end view. And so it wasn't obvious that everyone on the call had an end-to-end view, to your point. But let's just dig into some of the sort of the common areas that we found in terms of, we got quite a few data points on, the whole payment fraud piece. And I was shocked. I mean, I think the lowest number was 0.0026, and the highest was about 0.05. So sort of that's 5 basis points, I think. So from 5 basis points to less than 1 basis point. So it feels like that's an area that certainly for the retailers in this sample, payment fraud is now a difficult one for bad actors. I don't know whether that's something you're seeing.
Well, I think I read a report, admittedly it was pre-pandemic, that card not present fraud had actually sort of peaked and had started to diminish, and it's largely around, I think, analysis at scale from some of the big players. I think some of the payment fraud is becoming more manageable, and in other calls, not this one, we've had retailers talk about how, we think we've got the payment bit organized now, and what we've seen is a displacement to the returns process. So bad actors are just shifting, which is they're going where the opportunity is, and if you close off an easy opportunity, then you'll go to the next easiest opportunity.
And I think clearly there's a trade-off between sort of payments fraud and all sorts of loss to a certain extent in terms of your acceptance rate. And again, we saw the acceptance rates. The highest was I suppose the retailer that said they had the most number of blocks. Let's look at it like that, was 0.95% of all orders were blocked, whereas another retailer, so it was as low as 0.1%. And again, this is sort of comes back to sort of risk appetite, doesn't it? How much do you want to do? I mean, one retailer talked about really the value that they deliver as a department was around lowering that acceptance rate or block rates to release extra sales. And hope that this extra sales that you take that might be a bit risky doesn't lead to huge levels of losses on the payment fraud or any other types of fraud. So fascinating balance there in terms of exploring risk appetite for the retailers.
And I think over time you'd be able to quantify what's that sort of failure rate of these sort of risky transactions that you let through. And I think if you did a trial for 3 months, or you could even randomize different inventory SKUs or whatever, you could actually, I think, estimate or come up with a risk profile for these transactions. And under what circumstances do you have more confidence that they'll go through and not have a dispute or a chargeback or whatever, versus others. And the data is there. You've just got to sort of be able to collect the data and measure it, and then analyze the outcomes.
hopefully we can get hold of some of this as well. The other area that I heard talked about, there's one more after this, was around the sort of chargeback rates.
Mm,
And so it's which seemed quite low, but what the measurement that they seem to be looking at was what's the success rate of claiming,
mm.
these chargebacks. I think one retailer talked about 45% of all the chargebacks they receive, they successfully claim with the banks and get the money back. So that's quite an interesting metric that people are looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if this is if this is what you're referring to, there did seem to be a bit of variation with some of the solution providers that different retailers are using. That this was, I don't want to say a service, but they seem to have greater traction depending on what solution they had adopted. Really interesting implication if that's the case. If those statistics kind of bear fruit.
I mean, the area very close to you is the returns fraud, and I didn't really hear much data
Mm,
points or many KPIs linked to returns fraud. Although there were some people talking about sort of like, 0.39% of, I think goods lost in transit, disputed claims. I think
mm.
we heard a bit about that, 0.3, 0.4, 0.2%. But I didn't hear people sort of having a good sense of what percentage of returns were fraud. And I guess that must be a really difficult number to get hold of.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some retailers outsource their sort of returns processing, which I think makes it even more difficult. You're even further removed from that the data. Yeah, look, I think I mean more surprisingly, some of the research, I think it's Lisa Jack has done work for ECR Loss, says that some of the research suggests that retailers don't have good data on their return rate, let alone the return fraud. So, I think maybe we start with just having a very good understanding of what the return rate is before we get to fraud, because, if you don't even know what is the legitimate returns coming in, I don't know how you quantify fraud.
Yeah. And yeah, you're right. That's a good build. Well, look, I'm not sure if you've got any other notes, but I think our time is coming up. We're going to meet again with this group and maybe a few more on June the 12th. I
Mhm.
think we'll use the opportunity when you're in London to perhaps dig into this a bit more. But, I think it's really a real opportunity for ECR and yourself to really perhaps get out there with some good data
Mm.
from directly from retailers that can provide some sort of benchmarks, some sort of ways, both ways of measuring and KPIing
Yep.
this area. But then obviously with some benchmarks associated and really bringing, I suppose, to your point, Adrian's report to life and
Mm.
finding out exactly how we can go and fill that in.
Yeah, look, I think what we probably need to do as a next step is kind of like look at what's the data in each of those sort of parts of the pre-delivery, fulfillment, and returns that most retailers would have to hand, and that would be easy to integrate. It doesn't require lots of analysis. It's just percentage of sales or percentage of returns, and that
Yeah.
would be the place to start, I think. Just sort of see which of all the indicators that we could imagine most people have and that bears some insight into the different sources of loss. I think that's probably a place to start.
Yeah, and we'll do that in London as well. That's a good idea. Okay, well, Michael, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. I've got a full day's work ahead of me here, but I think it's time for you to relax generally.
Yeah, no worries. Well, enjoy your Tuesday, Colin. It's a great one. So I'm sure you'll be very productive today.
Well, thank you very much. All the very best. Thank you.
Okay, see you.
Bye. Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to all the ECR Retail Loss community for the sharing of their knowledge, their research, and latest learnings that ensure that we become truly a global platform for learning. My name is Colin Peacock. This is the Sell More and Lose Less podcast, and if you liked it, please subscribe so you automatically get all future episodes. And also, if you think your colleagues and friends might also like it, please ask them to follow ECR Retail Loss on LinkedIn and tune in to our next podcasts. If you didn't like it, then let us know and we'll try and fix it. Either way, see you next time. Thank you again.